My name is Sandra, and I'm the mother of an 18-year-old college student named Michael. For years, my husband Brian and I have made countless sacrifices to support his education, including skipping holidays and tightening our belts in every possible way to give him a chance at a better future. We reside in a cozy, albeit modest home that once belonged to my grandmother before she moved to a nursing home. Brian works at a local hardware store, and I manage the front desk at a doctor's office. We live a simple, no-frills lifestyle, which suits us just fine. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, the sun positioned perfectly in the sky, hinting at the weekend ahead when Brian's phone interrupted the peace. I was preparing dinner, my thoughts split between the meal and our budget when I heard him answer the call with a concerned, "Hello? Mom, slow down, what's wrong?" As I watched him pace back and forth, his face drained of color, the call ended and he collapsed onto the sofa, looking utterly deflated. "It's my parents," he said. "Their business has gone under. They're bankrupt and they've lost everything, including their house." My heart sank at the news. "Oh, Brian, that's awful. What are they planning to do?" "They want to stay with us for a while," he replied, clearly worried about our reaction. "Just until they sort things out." I paused, considering our already tight finances and the structured piece of our life that was now at risk of being disrupted. "And what did you tell them?" I asked. Brian massaged his neck, a sign of his stress. "I said I'd talk to you first. It's your house too, Sandra. I wouldn't decide this without consulting you." Brian's parents, Terry and Catherine, were far from easygoing. Accustomed to a luxurious lifestyle, our simple home was a stark contrast to what they were used to. "You know how they are, Brian. This house, it's not really their style," I reminded him. "I know," he replied, his expression troubled. "But they're my parents, Sandra. They're in a tough spot." Recalling the numerous times they had visited, barely concealing their disdain for our humble living arrangements, I knew they would be uncomfortable here. Yet, seeing them desperate enough to ask for help softened my stance. "All right, they can stay, but it's temporary, right? Just until they get back on their feet?" Brian immediately picked up his phone, and after a brief conversation, he reassured his mother, "Mom, Sandra, and I talked it over. You can stay for a bit, but you need to find your place soon. We're not running a hotel." I couldn't hear the response, but Brian's firm, "Yes, Mom, we're clear," told me enough. He hung up and sighed deeply. "They're thankful, Sandra. They'll be here next week." Last week, we told Brian's parents they could stay with us temporarily, and today they were moving in. I stood on the porch, my heart sinking slightly as two large moving trucks rolled up the driveway. Brian, managing a forced smile, directed the unloading process like a parking lot attendant. Terry was the first to emerge, slapping Brian on the back with a grin as if he'd just won the lottery. Catherine approached me next, her perfume overwhelming as she planted a kiss on my cheek that felt scalding. "You're an angel for letting us invade like this," she said. I managed a smile, my eyes shifting nervously to the mountain of belongings being unloaded, a tangible sign of the upheaval to come, as Catherine and the movers unloaded what she referred to as just the essentials from their moving trucks. I couldn't help but gape at the array of furniture and boxes that seemed to flood our modest front yard. "Is this all just essentials?" I mumbled under my breath, trying hard to keep my tone light. "Oh yes, just the basics for now," Catherine responded nonchalantly, waving her hand as if the mountain of belongings wasn't overtaking every inch of space. I bit my tongue, wondering what they had left in storage and if these were the items deemed necessary for their temporary stay. Brian caught my gaze, and I could tell he shared my concern. "Let's just try to get all this inside," he murmured, partly to himself, his tone a mix of resignation and disbelief. As Terry and Catherine directed the movers, with a precision that seemed better suited for a luxurious estate than our simple home, the movers struggled past with armchairs, an endless number of boxes, and even a grandfather clock. "Right there, that's perfect." Terry directed them to place the clock, as though it was the most natural addition to our living room, which was quickly disappearing under the influx of their possessions. I pulled Brian aside as the movers took a moment to catch their breath. "Brian, this is madness. They've brought enough stuff to furnish an entire house."
"Where are we supposed to put all of this?" Brian rubbed his temples, a sign of his growing frustration. "I know, Sandra. I'll talk to them, I promise. Let's just get through today." As the movers resumed, our ground floor transformed into a cluttered showcase of Terry and Catherine's old lifestyle. Every corner was filled, every space overtaken. By the time the movers left, our once cozy living room resembled more of a storage unit than a family space. Dinner that night felt like navigating a labyrinth. We barely managed to uncover the dining table beneath all the clutter. Terry and Catherine seemed completely oblivious to the chaos, blissfully chatting about their journey as Terry opened a bottle of pricey French wine. "Sandra, you really should try this," he insisted, pouring a glass with a flourish. "Thank you both so much for having us," Catherine added sweetly, her voice almost too sugary as she continued. "It's just until we find our feet." Brian, clearing his throat nervously, attempted to set some boundaries. "Yeah, about that. We need to talk about some ground rules. Space is tight and— "Oh, don't worry about it, son," Terry interrupted with a dismissive wave. "We'll manage just fine, won't we, dear?" He smiled at Catherine, who nodded enthusiastically. Looking around at the invaded space, the piles of boxes, the ostentatious ornaments displacing our simpler decor, I wasn't so sure about that. Adjusting to life with Terry and Catherine was proving to be more challenging than I'd anticipated. A few days later, as we settled into a new sort of routine, another challenge emerged. It was Tuesday evening, and I was preparing a simple dinner, spaghetti, when Catherine walked into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling in disdain. "What's that smell?" she asked, her tone dripping with disapproval. "It's dinner," I replied, striving to keep my voice calm. "Spaghetti? Where's the meat? The fresh herbs?" She scoffed, peering over my shoulder with a critical eye. Brian, hearing the commotion, came in drying his hands on a dish towel. "What's the problem?" "The problem, Brian, is that we're expected to eat this." Catherine gestured dramatically towards the pot of simmering sauce, as though it were unsavory. Taking a deep breath to maintain my composure, I explained, "It's what we usually eat. We can't afford steaks and fancy meals every night." As tensions flared in the kitchen, Brian intervened, his expression stern. "Mom, this is Sandra's home too, and this meal is what we normally eat. If you prefer something else, feel free to cook it yourself," he said firmly. Catherine's eyes narrowed as she retorted sharply, "Oh, we will, and we expect you to provide the groceries we need. We're not accustomed to living like this." I reached my limit. "I understand you're used to different standards, but this is what we can afford. Our budget doesn't stretch to cover luxuries." Terry, who had been silent until now, added his voice to the fray, booming, "Then perhaps, young lady, you need to reconsider your budget. We are not animals to survive on scraps." Brian's face hardened as he replied, "Dad, that's enough. We're doing our best here." The room was thick with tension, everyone visibly on edge. Catherine huffed dismissively, "Fine, tomorrow we'll give you a list of what we eat. Make sure it's here the next day." True to her word, Catherine handed me a list the following day filled with items like marbled beef, fresh seafood, and various imported and organic products. As I looked over the list, my heart sank. That evening, we sat down with Terry and Catherine, the list sprawled out on the kitchen table. Terry declared, "We expect proper meals, like steaks from marbled beef or the finest fish," as if such demands were entirely reasonable. Brian and I exchanged a look of disbelief. "We can't afford that," he stated, his voice firm yet tired. "It's just not in our budget." Their response was swift and cutting. "Lazy, both of you," Catherine snapped. "Can't even provide a decent meal." Feeling cornered, I eventually caved to their demands. I began purchasing only the highest quality ingredients for their meals, while Brian and I resorted to eating cheaper fast food to save on costs.
A month later, I reviewed our expenses and was shocked to see our food budget had doubled. Catherine's luxurious baths had also driven our water bill sky high. Dinner had turned into a nightly conflict, but this evening was different. As Terry and Catherine enjoyed their lavish dishes of marbled steaks and imported fish, Brian and I sat opposite them with plates of the simple pasta we could afford. The stark difference was not just in our meals, but was etching a deeper divide between us each day. Unable to contain my frustration any longer, I spoke up. "This has to stop. We can't keep living like this, eating different meals."
It's ridiculous. From now on, everyone in this house will eat the same food and we will stick to what we can afford. Terry laughed dismissively, a grating sound that tested my last nerve. You expect us to eat that slop? It's not slop, it's dinner. It's what we eat, I retorted, my patience wearing thin. Terry's laughter stopped abruptly, his face turning into a scowl. Catherine's tone was sharp and accusing. How can you be so greedy and lazy? Cooking decent food isn't that hard. They both turned to Brian, their expressions full of expectation, as if prompting him to side with them. That was the final straw for Brian. He slammed his hand down on the table, causing the plates to clatter. First off, this is Sandra's house as much as mine, and you will treat her with respect, he declared, his voice resonant with authority. Catherine's eyes welled with tears, her voice quivering as the impact of Brian's words sank in. I never thought I'd see the day when you, my son, would shout at me like that. Terry's frustration had reached a boiling point as he stood there, pointing his finger accusingly at Brian. Look at you, completely whipped and following her every command. Is this really who you've become? I maintained my composure, though my heart raced. Enough! This conversation is finished. From now on, no more lavish spending on steaks or seafood. We all eat the same simple meals. Their stares could have frozen the room in that moment of stillness. Then, silently, Terry and Catherine pushed their chairs back and left the table. Brian and I sat back down, enveloped in the heavy silence. He reached out and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry it came to this, he said. I nodded, feeling the burden of the evening's events. I am too, but it's the right choice. We can't go on like this. After the dinner blow-up, the atmosphere at home cooled, but only superficially. Terry and Catherine were noticeably quieter, but their silence had an underlying tension that kept me on edge. I sensed they weren't ready to accept the new household rules without a fight. A few days later, as I was cleaning up from a simple lunch of sandwiches, the doorbell rang. I dried my hands on a towel and walked to the front door, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, I found a delivery man with a large, fragrant bag from a fancy local restaurant. Delivery for Sandra, he announced, checking his clipboard. Confused, I said, There must be some mistake. I didn't order this. Just then, Catherine appeared with an overly bright smile. Oh, I decided to treat us to a nice meal. We deserved a little comfort after all the tension, she explained. I took the bag with hesitation. Catherine, we discussed this. We're cutting back on expenses. She avoided my gaze, shrugging. I thought it was on your tab, dear. My mistake. Brian entered from the kitchen, catching the tail end of our conversation. What's going on? He asked. Your mother thinks we deserved an expensive lunch, I replied, the weight of the bag suddenly feeling even heavier. Brian's expression darkened. Mom, we agreed. No more of this. Terry's voice boomed from the hallway. What harm is a little lunch going to do? You can't expect us to live like hermits forever. I placed the bag down, feeling my frustration rise. It's not just the lunch. It's every unnecessary expense. We've already told you. We're sticking to a budget. Catherine's demeanor turned icy. If you're going to fuss over a simple meal, perhaps we won't bother next time. Brian pinched the bridge of his nose, exasperated. It's not just about the meal, it's about respecting the household rules. You can't keep undermining us. The argument circled for a few more minutes until Terry and Catherine withdrew to their room, leaving the untouched, costly lunch on the table. Brian and I exchanged glances, a silent agreement between us that this couldn't continue. I'll call the restaurant, explain the situation, and cancel any future orders made without our approval, I declared, picking up the phone. Brian nodded, his resolve firm. I'll have another talk with them. This sneaky behavior has to stop. The peace was fleeting. After the incident with the unauthorized lunch, Catherine and Terry simmered with barely concealed resentment. The tension was palpable, and it felt as though you could slice through it with a knife. One evening, while I was washing dishes, the calm shattered once more.
Brian had just come in from the yard, looking tired. I was about to ask him about his day, when the sudden crash from the living room had us both sprinting to investigate. We discovered Terry looming over a shattered vase, one of the few household treasures I deeply valued. "What just happened?" Brian asked, his voice measured despite the chaos. "It just slipped out of my hand," Terry responded, his eyes barely reflecting any remorse. His tone wasn't one of apology, rather it carried a defiant edge.
Brian crouched to collect the broken pieces, and I couldn't keep quiet any longer. This vase was an heirloom from my grandmother. It has more history with this house than all of us. Catherine, leaning against the doorway, dismissively said, "It's just a vase, you can always find another." "That's not the point, Catherine," I shot back, the irritation rising in me. "This is about respect, something that's evidently lacking around here." "You want to talk respect?" Terry retorted, raising his voice. "How about the way you treat us, like we're second-rate residents in our own home?" Brian rose to his feet and faced his father directly. "You're here because we allow it, Dad. Don't forget that." "It doesn't feel like we're allowed anything," Catherine interjected sharply. "It feels like we're merely tolerated." Living with Terry and Catherine felt like navigating a field of landmines, but one particular evening drove me to my limit. We were sitting at the dinner table, the epicenter of many past disputes, when Catherine dropped her astonishing new request. "Brian, I saw a lovely coat today, and I think we should use Michael's college fund to buy it," she said, as nonchalantly as if she were talking about changing coffee brands. I choked on my drink, coughing as I set my glass down forcefully. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" My voice was a mixture of disbelief and escalating fury. With a sweet smile, Catherine mistook my astonishment for acquiescence. "It's only money, dear. Michael can take out loans for college. I do need a new coat." Brian, who had been silently fuming, slammed his fork down. "Mom, that's not happening. That fund is for our son's future, not for your shopping sprees." Catherine's expression turned sour. "How can you deny your mother such a simple thing?" "It's not simple, and we're not discussing this further," I declared, my last shred of patience dissolving. Terry raised his voice, now echoing off the walls. "You're being unreasonable and cruel. We are your family." He then threatened coldly, "Perhaps the local news would be interested in how you treat your parents. What would your employers think?" The mix of anger and apprehension roiled within me, but my resolve hardened. "Enough!" I stood up, my voice firm. "This is not how the family behaves. You two need to look for another place to stay. This arrangement isn't working." Catherine started crying, assuming the role of the aggrieved, while Terry continued his barrage of accusations and threats. The dinner ended with them leaving the room in a huff, and Brian and I were left in a deafening silence. Once the house quieted, I retreated to our bedroom and called my grandmother. She answered after a few rings, her voice a soothing balm. "Grandma, it's Sandra," I began, my voice choked with emotion. "What's troubling you, my dear?" she inquired, instantly concerned. I spilled everything, the incessant demands, the threats, the untenable situation with Catherine and Terry. She listened quietly, her occasional murmurs a comforting presence. When I finished, she spoke decisively. "I'll come and stay with you for a few months." "Are you sure, Grandma? What about the nursing home?" "I'm certain. It sounds like you need me right now." When Grandma declared she wouldn't stand by while our family was in turmoil, her voice was resolute and full of determination. Her arrival felt like a refreshing breeze had blown through our tense home. Although age had slowed her physically, her spirit remained undiminished, vibrant as ever. Terry and Catherine were noticeably discomforted by her sudden presence, their unease palpable. "I'll be staying on the ground floor," Grandma announced authoritatively as she entered, her suitcase trailing behind her like a faithful pet. "I expect we might need to rearrange some things." Terry's irritation was thinly veiled behind a forced smile. "Of course, we'll make sure you're comfortable, right?" He looked towards Catherine, who nodded rigidly, her eyes darting about, likely calculating the inconvenience this rearrangement would pose. Feeling a surge of relief, I was grateful that someone was finally setting things straight. Once the movers had adjusted our living space to accommodate Grandma, she wasted no time in calling a family meeting. "Now, I've heard a lot from Sandra about the ongoing issues, and I'm far from pleased," she began sternly, cutting through any semblance of pleasantries. Terry started to object, but Grandma raised her hand, silencing him. "I'm not finished. Technically, this house is still under my name, and while I've allowed Sandra and Brian to stay here rent-free, that privilege doesn't extend to you two."
Catherine's face paled. "You want us to pay rent?" she blurted out. "Yes, I do. $5,500 a month," Grandma stated flatly. "That's outrageous," Terry protested, standing up abruptly. "Considering the expenses you've incurred, it seems you could manage by reducing some of your luxuries," Grandma retorted sharply. "But we're family," Catherine interjected, her voice shaky. "Family doesn't take advantage of each other," Grandma countered firmly. "Since you've been living beyond your means at my granddaughter's expense, I find it only fair." Terry and Catherine were speechless, exchanging glances as if searching for an escape, but finding none. "And one more thing," Grandma continued. "If you find the rent too steep, you're welcome to look for another place to live. Alternatively, if you choose to stay, you'll assist me daily. I need help moving around, meals prepared, and someone to ensure I take my medications." Catherine's earlier bravado had completely vanished. She looked like a fish out of water. Terry, who had always valued his independence, seemed as if he'd been struck. "Think it over," Grandma concluded, her voice softening slightly. "I need your decision by tomorrow morning." As they retreated to their room, presumably to discuss their limited options, Grandma turned to us, her expression gentler. "Don't worry, kids. We'll sort this mess out." The morning after Grandma laid out her new house rules, it was as if a switch had been flipped in Terry and Catherine. I entered the kitchen to find them packing their belongings, a growing pile of boxes near the door. "We've decided to move out," Terry declared, not looking up from the box he was sealing. "We found a small apartment. We'll take our things and go." Catherine was busier, stuffing items into bags with swift, sharp movements. "It's for the best," she muttered, almost to herself but loud enough for me to hear. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity as boxes and furniture moved out the door. Brian helped, more out of a sense of duty than desire, as our home finally began to feel like a sanctuary again. By mid-afternoon, the section of the house that Terry and Catherine had occupied was eerily silent, a testament to their swift exit. The echo of their departure lingered long after they had driven away. Grandma, who had been observing quietly from her chair, gave me a knowing look. "Well, that's that then. They'll be all right, you know. Sometimes a bit of hardship is necessary to bring people back down to earth." We later learned that they had sold most of their possessions to cover the rent and their other debts. The luxurious lifestyle they were accustomed to had been pared down to the essentials, much like their new modest apartment. Grandma stayed with us for another 3 weeks, her presence a comforting constant in our home. But eventually she decided it was time to return to her nursing home. Driving her back, I felt a blend of sadness and relief wash over me. "Thanks for everything, Grandma. We couldn't have managed without you," I told her. She waved off my thanks with a chuckle. "Oh, nonsense. You're stronger than you think. Just remember to stand up for yourselves. No one else will do it for you," she advised, her words bolstering my confidence. I said farewell to her, assuring her that I would come back to visit soon. As I made my way back home, the space seemed more expansive and the silence deeper than before. That evening, Brian and I settled into our porch chairs, the gentle evening breeze comforting us. Life had certainly presented its challenges, but we had managed to navigate them successfully and were prepared for what lay ahead. We were confident in our ability to face the future as a team, regardless of what anyone else thought.
"Why is there some stranger here?" my sister-in-law sneered, stepping over the threshold of my house with her husband. Her eyes flashed with disdain. "Are you trying to leech off us? Leave the money and get out immediately," she demanded, venom dripping from her voice. I stood there, stunned. "You don't actually think you're staying here, do you? You and Virginia are practically strangers," her husband added coldly. "It's better if only blood relatives live together, so please leave as soon as possible," he concluded. All they cared about was forcing me out. They hurled insults, calling me a leech and an outsider. I'd had enough. Ignoring their words, avoiding their eyes, I gathered my things and walked out of the house. My name's Jasmine, a 35-year-old working housewife. Right now, I live a peaceful life with my husband Wesley and my mother-in-law Virginia. I never really had marriage on my radar, but I agreed to this arrangement with the understanding that I could continue working after tying the knot. Wesley is always such a sweetheart to me, always making sure I come first. I heard that his father passed away when Wesley was just starting middle school, and since then, Virginia has been holding down the fort, raising my husband and his sister on her own. We don't have any kids yet, but I bet bringing them up involves a lot of challenges I can't even begin to imagine. That's why I was worried about Virginia living on her own, so I proposed that we move in together after the wedding. "Virginia, what do you think about living with us, if you're okay with it? I'll be out during the day for work, so you'll have plenty of alone time like you're used to. Plus, isn't food always better when there are more people?" I asked. Virginia smiled. "Really? To be honest, living alone has been a bit lonely lately," she remarked. And just like that, we decided to share a roof. My husband had been worried about his mom living by herself, but he had been bottling up his feelings, not sure if he should suggest we all live together. In the end, we realized neither of our current places were really suitable for the three of us. So we went all in and bought a brand new house and started our life together. We set up Virginia, who has weak legs, on the first floor, and we took the second floor as our bedroom. Living with her turned out to be way more comfortable than I had imagined, and it didn't stress me out one bit. In fact, she taught me how to cook and even helped me with cleaning, which isn't really my strong suit. I was grateful for everything. "Virginia, thank you so much for cooking for us every day, but don't push yourself too hard," I told her. "We're going to be living like this for a long time, and if you burn yourself out now, it might be tough down the line." She shook her head. "What are you saying? I'm living with you, so let me at least do this. If I don't, I'd feel like I'm freeloading, and I can't stand that," she lamented. Our household was always filled with these lively exchanges. At first, my husband was nervous about potential mother-in-law and daughter-in-law disputes, but seeing us getting along so well, he was able to fully concentrate on his work without any worries. "Jasmine, thank you for getting along so well with my mom," Wesley said one evening. "I will work even harder to make you happy." Even though I already had all the happiness I needed, he always made such promises. "I'm already over the moon with joy, because I have you and your mom," I replied. If I got any greedier, I'm afraid I might jinx it. I hoped that these peaceful days would never end. That was my wish, but such a peaceful and happy life didn't last long. About 6 months after we started living together, I noticed that Virginia was acting a bit off. "Is something bothering you, Virginia?" "If you have any worries, I'm all ears," I asked gently. My mother-in-law, who was clearly feeling down, hesitated at first, but after a while, she opened up. "Well, Bonnie and Malachi have started dropping by almost every day," she confessed. "They said they were short on cash, so they took money from my purse, and they even raided the fridge. They're treating this house like their own." "What?" I gasped. It turned out that my sister-in-law and her husband were making themselves at home during the day, while my husband and I were at work. I remembered meeting them once, before we got married, and again at the wedding. Bonnie had looked me up and down as if she was sizing me up. "So this is Wesley's type," she remarked. "I never would have guessed. She's so plain, isn't she? She just fades into the background. If I were a guy, I wouldn't give her a second glance." She had just blurted out those words. Wesley had mentioned his sister was a bit wild, but I didn't think she'd be this bad. And despite being over 40, she didn't hold down a steady job and just did as she pleased. No wonder Virginia was taken aback. "She's been like this for years," Virginia sighed. "Even when I scolded her in the past, she never listened." "If you're saying it's because of how I raised her, I agree. It's all my fault." "No, that's not true. You're not at fault, Virginia," I reassured her. "It's a problem when adults act selfishly and cause trouble for others." Wesley, who had overheard the conversation, looked bewildered. "So my sister is still causing trouble," he said, sighing deeply. "She's a real piece of work. I thought she'd mellow out after getting married, but it seems to have done the exact opposite." From what I gathered, Bonnie's husband Malachi wasn't much of a go-getter either. He preferred a carefree lifestyle, taking odd jobs when he felt like it. Maybe that's why he was always scraping by, complaining about being broke and hungry. Wesley had tried to knock some sense into them in the past, but they never listened. "In 3 days, it's payday, and they'll surely come knocking," Virginia said, her expression unusually stern. I really wished to stop them this time. Wesley thought about taking a day off to confront them, but his workload made it impossible. "So I'll stick around with you instead," I suggested. "Gotta be better than leaving you to deal with them alone, right? If they start yakking about money, I'll step up." And so we started to carefully strategize our response. Sure enough, 3 days later, payday Friday, they showed up right as we were in the middle of making lunch. "Hey Mom, we're home," Bonnie said. "We're famished. Got anything good? Anything will do. Just rustle up some lunch, okay?" But upon seeing me, my sister-in-law frowned. "Wait, why is Jasmine here? Are you supposed to be working?" "I took the day off to spend time with your mom," I replied. "But wait a minute. You just said, 'We're home,' like this is your place. Isn't that a little strange?" I couldn't hold back my frustration at their audacious behavior. It's super weird to barge in announcing, "We're home," isn't it? And then to have the gall to ask her to whip up a meal for you. Just knowing that you've been treating our home like your personal pantry while we're not around really grinds my gears, I continued firmly. "What are you going on about? Acting all high and mighty? Remember your place?" Bonnie scoffed. "You're only here because of my brother. How dare you talk to me like that? If you've got time to argue, you'd better get started on making our lunch," she demanded. Her antics left me stunned, and Virginia looked completely dejected. After that, Bonnie did as she pleased, raided our fridge, and even walked out with a bag full of groceries. Familiarity shouldn't be an excuse for disrespect. This episode made me realize my sister-in-law and her husband completely missed that point. At least with me being present, they didn't broach the subject of money. That was a small consolation. When my husband got back from work and I briefed him on the day's events, he was seething. "I'll set them straight. I won't let them run rampant anymore. I've reached my limit," he said, his face flushed with an unusual intensity. Virginia kept apologizing. "I'm sorry for all the trouble." But I reassured her. "It wasn't your fault. We discussed a bunch of things until we felt a bit better." Following that day, my husband put his foot down, and their uninvited visits ceased, and Virginia began to regain her usual spirit. Just when I thought we three could get back to our peaceful life, about a week later, I got a phone call at work. "All right, I'm heading there right now," I said, my thoughts just blanking out. It turned out my husband had suddenly gripped his chest in pain at work and was rushed to the hospital. His coworkers said he was unconscious by the time he was transported, and they were giving him chest compressions. With my hands shaking and voice trembling, I quickly dialed Virginia. "Virginia, it's awful. Wesley has—" "Wesley?" she interrupted. "All right, I'm hailing a cab right now and heading to the hospital." She was quick to dash off. We each jumped in a taxi and raced to the designated hospital. We agreed to meet up at the hospital's general info desk and were then escorted to the room. But by the time we got there, my husband had already passed away. He was in cardiac arrest when he was brought in. We did everything we could, but I'm so sorry, the doctor explained. Wesley had died from a sudden heart attack. His mother and I were stunned by the sudden turn of events. The only solace was that my husband's face looked peaceful, as if he were simply taking a nap. He looked ready to wake up at any moment and ask, "Good morning, what's for breakfast today?" He wore such a tranquil expression. While mourning my unexpectedly departed husband, Virginia and I got to work on the funeral arrangements. Many people from his workplace, along with friends and acquaintances, showed up to pay their respects. The warmth at the funeral made it clear how much he had touched people's lives. Everything was so chaotic. Neither Virginia nor I had the time to grieve properly. There were no issues in his regular checkup, I said, crying. It's such a shame. If I had paid more attention to his health, this might not have happened. Virginia shook her head. What are you talking about? Jasmine, you did more than anyone could have expected. She and I continued to lift each other up. I was struggling to bounce back and ended up taking a break from work, staying home for a while. But amidst all this, another unexpected incident happened. This was about a month after my husband's sudden passing. Unexpectedly, our doorbell rang and Bonnie and her husband showed up. Excuse me? Why is a stranger in here? My sister-in-law sneered at me. This is absolutely ridiculous. Are you planning to mooch off us? Leave all your money and get out now, she demanded. I was totally taken aback. Even her husband chimed in. You're not thinking of staying in this house, are you? You and Virginia are practically strangers. I think it's best if only blood relatives live together from now on, so please leave as soon as you can. Next thing I knew, a moving truck pulled up, and the couple declared, laughing, "We're excited about living here, just us family." While I was grieving the loss of my husband, they showed no compassion at all. All they cared about was kicking me out of the house. They hurled insults, calling me a leech and an outsider. I'd had enough. Arguing with people like that just wasn't worth it. While I was packing my things in my room, Bonnie mocked, "What's up? Feeling blue you can't stay in this house? I know being a widow's tough, but you've got to hang tough. You're younger than me. You'll manage somehow." I disregarded her words, didn't make eye contact, and left the house. Obviously, I have no clue what happened to them after that. The first place I headed after walking out of that house in silence was, of course, the real estate agent. It was to quickly put up for sale the house and property that Bonnie had usurped. There was no mortgage to pay off, and if I could get the paperwork done, I could wash my hands of the two. That was my plan. I had a gut feeling about this, so I had made various preparations just in case things went south. I had mapped out various escape routes for Virginia to get away from her daughter, and just in case, I had even secured a potential new place. Bonnie and her husband probably planned to live off Virginia's savings, but I wasn't about to let them have their way. Even if there's no blood bond, I decided to take care of my mother-in-law for the rest of her life. Virginia announced she was going shopping and dropped by my place. "Virginia, let's stay at this hotel until our new place is ready. It's gonna be a bit tight. We'll be sharing a room for a while, but bear with me, okay?" I said. "I'm not worried about that. But do you think we'll be all right? Those kids might start tailing us again," she replied, visibly nervous. I reassured her, "Don't sweat it. I won't let them push us around anymore." Things were quiet for a while, but sure enough, about a month later they contacted us in a flurry. "Hey, what's happening? We've been thrown out. This is Wesley's house. Or wait, it's in Mom's name, isn't it? You can't just kick us out like this," Bonnie yelled over the phone. As anticipated, she was all shaken up. "The counterattack finally begins here." "Well, that house has been in my name since I bought it. I have no plans of living with you guys, and if I can't live there, there's no point in keeping the property. So I sold it. We've already found a buyer and we're waiting for you guys to vacate, so please leave as soon as you can," I calmly explained. "But even if you suddenly tell us to leave, we have nowhere to go. We're unemployed and we have debts. It's too harsh to just yank away our place to live," Bonnie pleaded. "Excuse me?" I was baffled by what she was saying. "But I was evicted from that house that day too. Remember you said something like, 'When will you stop mooching off other people?' But I left without a fuss, didn't I? Why don't you guys just check into a hotel or something? I'm telling you, we don't have any money. Where are you right now? You're with Mom, aren't you? Let me talk to her. Otherwise, we won't be able to survive," my sister-in-law insisted desperately. I figured they must be significantly in the red and already being hounded by debt collectors. That's not our problem. If I may be so blunt, could you stop pestering Virginia? We're aware you've nearly drained all of her savings. Please stay out of her life from this point forward, I stated firmly. How can you be so heartless? Bonnie stammered. My sister-in-law, who was so brazen just a moment ago, must have realized the gravity of the situation after hearing my words. From there, the situation devolved into her crying like a toddler and starting to apologize. In a mix of frustration and compassion, Virginia let out a sigh and reluctantly began to address her daughter. Bonnie, if you think you can continue to lean on me, you're sorely mistaken. Remember using all of your dad's life insurance to pay off your debt? You promised you wouldn't repeat that, but you've hardly worked and gambled again, haven't you? I'm done. Don't ever reach out to me again, she declared. What? Mom, don't say that. Don't be so harsh, Bonnie sobbed. We could hear her tear-choked voice on the other end of the line, but Virginia ended the call abruptly. Jasmine, let's block her number. It'll be a nuisance if she keeps hounding us. She clearly doesn't intend to change her ways. So annoying. Virginia vented her frustration. My mother-in-law, who had previously been racked with fear and anxiety, now had a revitalized look on her face. Maybe because she finally got to say what she needed to say. After that, when my sister-in-law realized that I had blocked her number, she went into overdrive trying to reach us. She called Virginia, tried to get through on my late husband's still active phone, and was relentless. Since we had zero intentions of handing over our new address, and any further talks were just draining, both my mother-in-law and I blocked her on WhatsApp and set our phones to reject her calls. Stubborn as she was, Bonnie even went to our relatives, broadcasting her woes left and right, pleading for financial help. However, all our relatives clued in on her past gambling debts seemed to have chosen to turn a deaf ear to her pleas. After being booted out, she and her husband found themselves without a roof over their heads. They resorted to day jobs to get by and spent their nights in a park until they could secure an apartment. They had been so high and mighty before, but look at them now. It's a sorry sight. At this stage, Virginia and I have no plans to lend them a helping hand, no matter what. We're just going to sit back and watch them sink into their debt-filled abyss. A month breezed by, and I finally came to terms with the harsh reality of my husband's death and made my way back to work. I had dropped a bunch of weight and it was causing concern, but now, after work, I return home to my sweet mother-in-law, who greets me with a warm smile. It's incredibly comforting. While our living arrangement is a tad unconventional, I want to keep living this pleasant life with her.